програмі сьогодні президент Канадсько-української фундації імені Тараса Шевченка Андрій Hladyshewsky пояснить, чому дата 20 червня 2020 року має мати особливе значення для Канади і українців Канади.
Вітаємо вас, дорогі глядачі, на українській телемережі «Контакт». Сьогодні маємо надзвичайно велику приємність говорити з президентом Шевченківської фундації, паном Андрієм Hladyshewskym. Пане Hladyshewsky, вітаємо вас на нашій передачі. І хочу сказати, що взагалі ми, українці в Канаді, останньо отримали такий лист від Шевченківської фундації, що називається «Where flowers bloom, so does hope». І тут, власне, зазначено дату 20 червня, і що 100 років тому були розіслані домів люди, які були інтерновані в той час Першої світової війни. Яке є значення цієї дати не тільки для українців, взагалі для канадського суспільства?
Дякую, Юрій. 100 years ago, the closing of the internment camps is very significant because it's June 1920. And we know that armistice occurred, November 11th, 1918. So for a full year and a half, these Ukrainian men, Ukrainian Canadians, and people from other communities were still kept in camps. We're still kept in work camps doing forced labor. We're still in primitive conditions. And it wasn't until the last camp was closed on June 20th, 1920, that they were finally released from confinement. It's important too because at the same time, under various naturalization acts, a bunch of men were deported after 1918, even though the war was over. 70,000 to 80,000 Canadians of Ukrainian descent had their voting rights removed well into 1920. So it's an important date for Canadians because the War Measures Act was used as a very repressive tool. And at the time, this concept of human rights don't have the same meaning as they have today. And so the government repression, these men could have been kept well beyond the wars, which they were, under these repressive legislative enactments. So June 20th is important. It's the release from confinement in the last camp of these Ukrainian men and back to their women, and this is the 100th anniversary of that.
I would just like to make public that under the influence of Boris Sidoruk, we're going to be honoring, commemorating this date on Contact with a show dedicated to this topic, and it's going to happen on the weekend that relates to the date of June 20th, and sort of in a sense back to the letter that came under your name from the Shevchenko Foundation with the flowers. What was the message that you were trying to send out as president of this important foundation?
Well, we're inextricably linked to the internees because the foundation is actually holding the $10 million settlement fund on behalf of the community. As you know, the three national groups, the Shevchenko Foundation, Ukrainian Canadian Congress, and Ukrainian Canadian Civil Liberties Association negotiated a settlement. So for the Shevchenko Foundation, we wanted to show the release from confinement in a certain way. These internees were released from confinement, but here we are 100 years later under COVID-19, and we are in sort of a mental confinement as a community. And we too are trying to release ourselves from that and become back to the kind of community that we know ourselves to be. So we wanted to send out flowers of hope. There's hope. Those internees 100 years ago finally were given their freedom, and they had hope that they could now recover their present and futures. And we are the same way, Nasha Hromada. We have to recover our our center of gravity. We'd like people to plant these flowers, to let them grow out, have those green shoots in the summer, and that the flowers will bloom. And that's a sign of hope. And we're so tied in an agrarian and in a gardening sense as Ukrainians. Everybody understands this. That yes, there are significantly bad times, nowhere near the times that those internees spent. But we, in some sense, share a sense of confinement. And in their honor, we'd like to see people plant these flowers and then think about them as they themselves regenerate their own hope for the future.
Well, Mr. Hladyshewsky, thank you very much for offering us this great example of hope. But at the same time, we want to thank you very much for the stewardship that you're presenting at the Shevchenko Foundation, including the management and stewardship of this endowment fund that relates specifically to the issues that relate to this 100 years ago on June the 20th, when with the release of all these unjustly interned Ukrainian Canadians.
Absolutely. Вічна їм пам'ять for what they contributed to the cause of freedom for this country and the wonderful legacy that they left fortunate people like you and myself to be able to live in such a land.
Дорогі глядачі, це був президент Конгресу, програми, яка Конгресу українців Канади, яка називається Шевченківська фундація, президент пан Андрій Hladyshewsky, відносно відзначення століття інтернування українців в Західній Канаді. І вернемося до передачі відразу після наступних реклам.